It's episode 11 of the Rooks and Becords podcast. I'm your host, Ted, and in this episode, John Young and I are cranking up the volume to 11 to spotlight the year 1981 in rock music. To me, it was one of rock's best years, with many albums that went on to be iconic. And yes, classic, as in classic rock. And later, I talked to D.W. Dunphy, a fellow music journalist and musician, about the challenges of being an independent musician in an age where the physical sale of albums is falling while the popularity of streaming is on the ascent. Oh, and we touch on a kind of controversial statement Adam Levine from the group Maroon 5 made about the disappearance of bands. But let's get started with 1981, one of rock's best years. Some sounds from 1981 and a classic rock power segue, but fitting, since 1981 was, in my opinion, one of rock's greatest years. And by that, I mean it was a year when a number of phenomenal albums were released, albums that have become classics, and many rightly so. Indeed, you can't turn on classic rock radio these days without hearing AC/DC, Rush, Billy Squier, Foreigner, and the like. But 1981 was also a year when other genres were ascending. Synth and synth pop were kind of born out of the ashes of punk rock, and the prevalence of synthesizers in pop, rock, and new wave would temporarily knock guitar-based music down a peg, but only for a few years. By 1984, guitars, bass, and drums were back in a big way in rock music, and even alternative rock went back to basics, as it were. The Smiths, Simple Minds, Echo and the Bunnymen, The Alarm, all found their popularity rising with guitar-based music. However, in 1981, rock was still the king of the AOR charts, and the record-buying public in suburbs around North America was eating it up, making many artists incredibly rich and solidifying their place in music history. On this segment of the Rooks and Becords podcast, John Young and I are going to take a little jog down the boulevard of unbroken dreams in rock music and spotlight our top 5 from 1981. Well, hiya, John. How you doing?
Hey, for those about to rock, we salute you. Ted, how are you? It is great to be back on the Rooks and Becords podcast. Thanks for having me, my friend.
Oh, absolutely. It's always great to have you on. A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post on my personal blog, and that's pykorry.com, Pykorry. It's basically a Maori expression, believe it or not, that means by golly. And I just liked it because I found it in the dictionary and thought it was funny. But anyway, I was kind of surprised after taking a deep dive into albums released in 1981 to see how many of them are classics now. And before we get to some of my picks, I have to comment on episode 10. This is episode 11, so if you want to listen to episode 10, you'll know what I'm talking about for a moment. Those who listen to this podcast regularly know that John is the morning show host on 95.3 KUIC. He's also a musician. And for those wondering who was doing all that singing and playing guitar in the last episode, it was John, all John. I emailed you, John, that my mother even commented that your voice and guitar playing were absolutely wonderful. And she wasn't sure at first whether you were doing it all, like all that singing and picking. And I assured her that it was all you. So nice job, my friend.
I appreciate you and your mother saying that about me. In fact, if we'd had video running, we could have proven it, right? Because there was no studio trickery involved. It was funny to see me sitting on a stool that's taller than the desk, guitar pointed in the wrong direction so I wouldn't hit any of the printers or anything that's surrounding me, and still able to pull it off. That was a lot of fun. I recommend people go listen to that cast because we really got into the weeds when it came to song construction. It was pretty cool.
It was wonderful. I mean, you have a fantastic voice and you play guitar super great. I mean, I'm just like, wow,
You were sweet
this
to say
guy,
that.
this guy is really good.
$20
And
for Ted. Send Ted $20. You heard me.
oh, look, Venmo, it popped up 20 bucks. It's great.
I love technology, Ted.
Let's start with this iconic year of 1981. We have our top five. So I want you to take your first one. You go first. So what's number five on your list?
Number 5 on my list, 1981. Can we just frame the year real quickly here?
Sure.
1981, the year you and I got our driver's licenses, it was a seminal year for me in a lot of ways because I went from being, a pimply faced, peach fuzz mustached kid who couldn't get anywhere on his own to a pimply peach fuzz mustached kid who had a car with a cassette deck in it, my 69 Volkswagen Beetle. And I played a lot of the albums we're going to talk about in cassette form all over Southern California as I drove around, just to set the scene. But I will start with a classic record from 1981, number 5 on my list, Tattoo You by the Rolling Stones. I'm not sure a lot of people know that Tattoo You, which people associate, I think anybody who knows the record, with the big hit Start Me Up, which came from that album and those sessions. But the sessions that produced that album were not much of a sessions at all. In fact, the Rolling Stones in 1981 were not necessarily getting along great with each other. Maybe not a surprise, but they'd been together for what at that point, I don't know, close to 20 years. And they had touring obligations with solo stuff they were doing. And so Tattoo You, believe it or not, is made up mostly of outtakes from sessions they had done going back to the end of the 60s, believe it or not. So you had songs on there that featured Mick Taylor, their previous amazing lead guitar player, on it, on certain songs on that record. But that record is still known primarily for having Start Me Up and Waiting on a Friend. The slower melodic song with the video was so stark, filmed in New York City. I'll never forget, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, who couldn't stand each other at the time, hanging out and waiting on each other. I'm not waiting on a lady. I'm just waiting on a friend.
Those were probably the two biggest singles off that record, right?
Well, they were the two biggest singles. Yeah. They were the two biggest videos because remember also in 1981, the emergence of MTV towards the end of that summer, MTV played the crud out of both of those songs. And so I, of course, had to run it. I was a Rolling Stones fan anyway at age 16, but this is new Stones back then. And Start Me Up was all over FM radio. And I bought the record and then quickly got home and realized, wait, a lot of these songs could have been on Beggar's Banquet. It could have been on Sticky Fingers, because they were outtakes. That album was literally thrown together, and yet it's still considered one of the best albums in the Rolling Stones canon.
Yeah, see, at the time, I did not even know the backstory on that record. I just thought they were all new songs.
Well, that's why I'm here, Asregadoo, to help you understand those things. The album cover itself won I believe it was a Grammy for Best Artistic Package of a record the following year. So it was, again, for an album slapped together out of outtakes for the most part, it did pretty well.
It's a very eye-catching album cover, and it's certainly, if you were looking at a record store, it would grab your attention pretty quickly. That's for sure.
Well, what's your number 5, Ted? Is that how we do this? Do you get to do your number 5?
Sure, yeah. Let's go in order from 5 to 1. It's the Go-Go's, Beauty and the Beat. I just thought this is a fantastic record. I read about the Go-Go's in Rolling Stone magazine at the time. I had some allowance money, and I ran down to a local record store with my oldest brother. I said, which one should I get? And he's all like, I know which one you're going to get. I said, which one? The one with the girls. You're going to get the Go-Go's. He was right. So I bought that. I brought it home and I was just like, wow. I mean, I'd heard Our Lips Are Sealed and We Got the Beat. So I knew those songs because they were already played on the radio. But what I didn't know, of course, was the rest of the record, which is absolutely pound per pound fantastic. You've got, certainly the hits, but it's got this 1960s vibe thing going on, but it's more aggressive, but not overly so. But the hooks on this record, how can you just say that, oh, it's not all that great? Just listen to it. Listen to songs like How Much More or Tonight or Lust to Love. These are all infectious pop of the highest caliber. So I can't recommend this album enough. Number 4, John.
Number 4 for me will be Phil Collins' Face Value. And why is this album on my list? Well, because Phil Collins did something for drums. I'm a drummer, for those of you who don't know that.
And a guitarist.
It's fun to be able to play two instruments. If I could just play the bass, I could be my own band. Think about it.
You could go down to Pier 39 in San Francisco when the pandemic's
Look at
over.
Me playing Phil Collins covers. The reason this album is on my list is because of what Phil Collins did for electronic drumming. Now, he's not the first artist to use drum tracks or, electronic drums in a big hit song. But In the Air Tonight, which is the big single off this record, he employs an electronic drum beat to go along with the actual acoustic drums that he recorded in the studio in such an effective way, a haunting way, a methodical way. He put the drums together between electronic and acoustic that had really, as far as a big hit pop record, hadn't been explored the way that Phil Collins did it. And a lot of people still in 1981 associated Phil Collins properly with the band Genesis, where he's at that point the lead singer and the drummer. But this solo record of his really took the Phil Collins solo brand into that stratosphere that by the mid 80s, people were like, "You're in another band? I thought I was just going to see Phil Collins live. Well, he plays in another band, sweetheart. Did you realize that? Some band called Genesis." Anyway, that record, and as a drummer, stuck out to me. I kept thinking, I've got to get electronic drums somehow. Now, back in 1981, an electronic drum program and patching and whatnot probably cost $40,000, but
yeah, you had to be a professional musician of making millions to afford something like that.
You could see Phil saying basically to his producer, "I don't care what it costs, man. Get me that beat. I've got to have that tick, 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 tick thing playing along as I thump through on In the Air Tonight. Oh, crank up the sound, man." Yeah, that's how that album ended up on mine. Now, where is your number 4?
Before I get to that, I wanted to comment a little bit about that Phil Collins record, in that a lot of people, because In the Air Tonight was such a huge hit, and Missed Again, I think Missed Again was on that record as well, right?
Missed Again's a great tune. Yeah, there's a lot of great music on that album. That's a good point.
But it's all the other songs that people don't listen to, and it runs the gamut stylistically. It's not just boom, 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 the same thing over and over. But he does a lot of like sort of world music and things like that. So it's kind of a hybrid album of both pop, soul, and sort of progressive rock all in one, with some world music thrown in. So it's a fantastic album. I agree. That's a really good one, but it's not my number 4. My number 4 is the Moody Blues Long Distance Voyager.
Listen to you. Wow.
Okay. There's a backstory to the Moody Blues. As a kid, and I'm talking maybe 7 or 8 years old, my mother and my oldest brother, the same one who said, "You're going to get the Go-Go's, I know it," they were big Moody Blues fans. And then when my mother remarried in the mid 70s, my stepfather was also a big Moody Blues fan. So the music was on a lot in the house. All those core albums from the 70s, I would listen to those over and over because that's pretty much the soundtrack then. When this record comes out in 81, I go to see the band at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. I had to look up the set list to see the actual date, and it was June 24th, 1981. And that was a big year for me because I saw Rush just a few weeks before that. What I do remember was they did a solid set, and they played a whopping 9 out of the 10 songs off that record, off of Long Distance Voyager.
Wow.
I just looked at Setlist FM and want to thank them also for reminding me what a great set it was, and that it tells you that what the band thought of this record. Because often when bands have a new album, they can say, "And this is from our new album," and then people start leaving and going to get beer or something to eat, right?
They're playing off the new record. Bob, let's go get a Bud Light. What do you think? Sounds good.
Let's go. Really. The big singles off of that were The Voice and Gemini Dream. So those are the ones that are still probably played on the radio. But there are some other great songs like Talking Out of Turn, 22,000 Days, In My World, and Veteran Cosmic Rocker. It just kind of shows a wide spectrum of musical styles. And this was also the year that they replaced their original keyboardist, Mike Pinder, with a guy named Patrick Moraz, who played with Yes for a while, but he was also kind of a session player and played in and out of various bands. But he was the one that kind of took the band's sound and really gave it a modern sheen, for, if you want to call it, well, new wave. It wasn't quite new wave, but it was definitely newer in terms of the Moody Blues sound. So that's my number 4.
Well, and let me just also say about 1981, and you're talking about new wave and that juncture point that we've discussed on this podcast before. 1981 is so clear to me that it was the last year I really felt good about being basically a rocker with a slight move towards new wave. 81 was that year for me. And that's where my number 3 comes in. Duran Duran's Planet Earth. Duran Duran was another one of these sort of British techno bands. There was a lot of them coming out in the late 70s and early 80s, the tail end of the punk movement there in Britain. But if you listen to Planet Earth,
the first Duran Duran album, right?
Yes, the first Duran Duran record.
Gotcha.
It was a great way for me to transition, if you will, from the guitar-based rock that I love and still love to a new wave sound because you had a bloke named Andy Taylor who could play the guitar, shred on that thing, but you've still got Simon Le Bon and you've got Nick Rhodes kind of playing keyboards and kind of playing synthesizers and sequencers. You've got a live drummer in Roger Taylor, but he's still playing some electronic drums in the live acoustic kit. And then you've got one of the premier, still to this day, premier bass
Oh,
players in
man.
John Taylor, who was basically a funk bass player. So you
Yeah.
had these elements of funk and hard rock mixed with new wave. And it was a great way for me to go, yeah, I can get into this new wave thing. Or wait, back in 1981, I can get into this new wave thing. They were helping transition me because I could still see the videos. They're playing guitars. I mean, Andy Taylor's playing a Les Paul. That's not a very new wavy guitar, but he's got one strapped down there and hanging down below his knees, rocking and rolling on songs again, like Planet Earth and like Girls on Film and some of the other tunes on that record. And that's why it made my number 3.
If there's one thing I can say about early Duran Duran records, and that's Rio and the self-titled one that's your number 3, is John Taylor's bass work is kind of pushed down into the mix because he is a phenomenal bass player. When I was on Instagram, I used to follow him because he would do these little, almost like tutorials on how to play certain Duran Duran songs on the bass. I'm all like, this guy's got some thunder fingers, man. He is really good.
Yeah, I almost wonder if he was too good. You make the point that they buried some of that stuff in the mix. Although you still, if you listen to, take a deeper dive into Girls on Film, and that
Okay.
the bass part in that song is holding it up. Yeah, you can try to mix that down, but you can't mix away a John Taylor bass part. Come on, Nigel.
It just like it was a little too thin. I thought this guy's
agreed.
got, this could be really funked up and really kind of a fat bass sound. And I was just hoping that would be the case, but maybe one day they'll remix the album and then, they'll kind of tweak the knobs a little bit and make it fatter.
Well, let's
in terms of the sound.
So fatten up your number 3. What is it, Ted?
My number 3 is a number 2.
Oh, that's
which is
are we at number 2 already? Am I not paying attention?
No.
Please.
No, my number 3 has a number 2 in the title. It's Pretenders 2. I was trying to make a joke, but it didn't go well. Okay. Pretenders 2 is up there because it was the album where I became a massive Pretenders fan. It's an odd album because it comes out like months after they released an EP, which was called Extended Play. They weren't very original with the title, but that EP contained the Talk of the Town. There was no the on there. Talk of the Town and Message of Love. These are some of their most popular songs, but it started my deep musical crush on Chrissie Hynde around that time. And I remember buying a t-shirt at Rasputin Records in Berkeley, California that had the album cover of Pretenders 2 silk screened on the front. And I was wearing it proudly to school. And even though I'm not a musician, I tried to be in a band in high school like tons of other guys. And I wore it to school. And the guy who was the guitarist and I'm using air quotes because the band survived maybe 2 days. He looked at me and he was all like, looked at my shirt and he goes, "Who is that?" I go, "Oh, Pretenders." And he's like, "Why do you always like these weird groups nobody's ever heard of?" And he sort of walks away. And it's just like, I'm like, wait, but they're really great. And I just felt like, maybe this new wave thing isn't going to last.
Well,
but then the Pretenders do, of course, because they're still going.
Oh my God, Ted, sometimes I wish I could get inside the Ted head because you picked I would have put I would have put that album on my list based on the combo platter of Extended Play and Pretenders 2. If you look at that all as one body of work, and I love their first record, which I think came out late 79.
79, 80-ish.
Right. I was a huge fan too, a huge fan of Chrissie Hynde, a huge fan of her vocal style, which is still one of the most unique in rock. Jealous Dogs off of that record is still one I can just hear that beat, that Martin Chambers shuffle and think, oh, goodness sakes, you're killing me.
The thing about Chrissie Hynde, and I think that people don't realize it, is that she has a weird vocal phrasing. And I don't mean weird in a bad way. It's a unique vocal phrasing. And at the time, Martin Chambers, who was a drummer, and Pete Farndon, who was, their late bassist, he died, I think around shortly after the release of this record.
1983 in his bathtub.
Oh, that's right. It was 83. It was James Honeyman Scott that died first.
82.
He was a guitarist. Yeah. Pete Farndon and Chambers would have to work out the sort of the lower end, the rhythm section to her demos because they were like, wow, this phrasing is really weird. How are we going to come up with a rhythm section on this? So that's why the Pretenders music has this kind of odd quality to it. And that Martin Chambers drumming is really fantastic. It's very unique. in many ways. And because he had to be based on the demos that he was working off of from Chrissy Hind.
Could not agree more. By the way, kids out there who have not familiarized yourself with the Pretenders, go buy or download Extended Play. I know Ted mentioned Message of Love and Talk of the Town. Cuban Slide is also on that record and is phenomenal. So that's my my 2 cents.
Extended Play, if you can get it, it's not available digitally. You have
I'm
to get
looking
it
at it.
on
I am
vinyl.
holding it right now in my record room. Gosh, that's a good
They
one, Ted.
have probably the best live version of Precious on there. I've
Yes.
heard a number of live versions of that, but none compares to that one.
Recorded in New York's in Central Park, I think, back in 1980.
Yeah.
It's just classic. Good call.
It's blistering.
Yep.
It's so good.
It'll rip your face
really,
off. Yep, it's good.
They are on fire. All right, so your number 2.
Number 2 does not have the number 2 in it. In fact, I think this is number 4 is my number 2. I'm confusing you because I'm talking about Van Halen's Fair Warning record, which came out in 1981. Van Halen at this point had released, of course, their first 2 albums, which were gazillion sellers. I think their third record was Women and Children First, which came out in 1980 and had some great tunes on it. Fair Warning is not necessarily known as their greatest hit record with a lot of radio play, although Unchained was featured still to this day on classic hard rock stations and classic rock stations all over the world. Why I point to this record as an aspiring guitar player and drummer. Alex Van Halen is sometimes underrated. He was a great drummer. He still is. I know Eddie Van Halen passed away this past October. If you go take a deeper dive into Fair Warning, the record, you are going to hear some of the most impossible to replicate guitar solos that have ever been put on a record anywhere. And if you talk to any serious professional shredders from the 80s, 90s, or current shredding session guitar players, they will tell you there is stuff Eddie Van Halen did in an analog fashion back in 1981 in the studio that literally no one can duplicate. They still can't figure out some of the guitar solo work that he did on some of those songs. That's why I put it in there. It just was one of those things where before shredding was shredding, and it certainly shredded on the previous 3 records, but he was a little more melodic, and the songs in the first 3 Van Halen albums were a little bit more commercial friendly for the most part. Fair Warning just takes it to another level. On top of that, Ted, Fair Warning was the name of the tour that Van Halen did, huge worldwide tour in 1981. It was my first rock concert I ever went to. I saw them at the LA Forum on the Fair Warning tour. You can go to YouTube, their Oakland show, which is one of the bigger ones they've got from 1981 that's on YouTube. And it's from that tour. A couple nights after I saw them, they opened with Running with the Devil. I think the third song in was Unchained. They were just at the peak of their kick-ass rock personas with Eddie Van Halen, just rewriting how you play electric guitar.
That album is such a hard rocking album. I mean, it is just the production of it. It's just got such a heaviness to it. And it's, I could see the appeal if you're, a young John Young, 16 years old, and you want to rock.
Oh man.
There it is.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's exactly why I picked it. It hits you in the side of the head in the best way possible if you just really want, you're right. It's heavy. And 1981, I could probably go into a deep dive, maybe with Black Sabbath or, other stuff that might've been around, but I don't remember anything being as heavy in melodic rock, for lack of a better way to describe it, than that Van Halen record from 1981.
Oh, I agree. So my number 2 is The Police's Ghost in the Machine. And if you listen to this podcast, you'll know that I mentioned this record on the very first podcast when I was spotlighting Andy Summers' book, One Train Later. And it's my favorite album by the band. It really is a dark new wave classic. And I felt it from the first few times I heard this record that there was something really, really wonderful about these songs. Now, it didn't produce a ton of hits, but the hits that it did have, they really, took off. Like Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic. Spirits in the Material World did pretty well. Even Invisible Sun wasn't too bad. It did okay on the charts. But it's all the other songs that are on there, from Demolition Man to Darkness to Too Much Information, Hungry for You. All of those songs to me at the time, I was just listening to this band and thinking, this is my band. Because I have a small group of this is my band bands, and The Police were it. And it was because of this record.
Well, that record struck me too, Ted. You couldn't have picked a better amazing album from 1981. Not only all those songs you mentioned, which as a drummer and guitar player, not so much a guitar player, Andy Summers is terrific, but as a drummer in the early 80s, Stuart Copeland was one of my heroes, one of my top 5 drummers. And the drum work that he does on Ghost in the Machine, although he's great on every record, he really shows you what he's capable of, the way he fuses rock and African rhythms together in a way that's just, I mean, listen to the drum work that he does on Spirits in the Material World, because people have heard that song on the radio. Demolition Man. Watching them live, that was another one of my second or third concert I ever saw was the Police's Ghost in the Machine tour, again at the LA Forum with Oingo Boingo opening for them. Hello. New wave mic drop explosion. Oh my God. It was a new wave massacre of amazing music that day. And that record, when I bought it, became my Police album. I had Outlandos d'Amore. I had
Regatta de Blanc.
Yeah, I had Regatta de Blanc. I had the one that
Zenyatta Mandata.
Well, Don't Stand So Close to Me. Is that? Yeah, I guess that's Zenyatta Mandata. Anyway, funny album names. I loved Ghost in the Machine. It's probably still my favorite Police record because from start to stop, every one of those songs not only is a rockin' tune, but man, the lyrics, the production, I'm a huge fan.
Alrighty, John, what is your number one?
My number one album from 1981 is For Those About to Rock, We Salute You from AC/DC, or as Brian Johnson, the lead singer at the time, might say, For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. You all look great tonight. And I warn you, when you do a Brian Johnson imitation, you will pay. You will pay dearly for the next several minutes because you've strained some vocal cords in a way that's hard to recover from.
It's true. I mean, he's a hard guy to imitate.
Oh my God. And so great when he's just talking, because he's good, that accent, British Scotland, and I was rocking with the Angus and Malcolm, we were talking about guitars, and then, you look great, man. You look. Okay, thank you, Brian. Just step aside. I want to talk about this great record. I have always been a huge Back in Black fanatic. I think it's probably my favorite AC/DC record. There's the dog. He loves that album too.
Yeah, I can tell.
This is really a companion record to Back in Black. You've pointed that out before, Ted. This record, For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, had some of the nastiest, politically incorrect 3-chord 4/4 rock and roll that I can remember as a young man, as a teenager, a 16-year-old back in 1981. The title track, it's still played on classic rock radio today, For Those About to Rock, We Salute You. There are so many other just deliciously bad for your ears tunes on that record that are just, they're not even trying to hide the sense of inappropriateness, let's put it that way, that they infused into that album. Songs like Let's Get It Up are just, I mean, they're just classic. They're not even using innuendo. It's like, and when I hear those songs, I want to be a part of that songwriting session where these, they're all millionaires by the point of this record coming out and saying, I think we could just say, let's talk about, erections and how should we rock that? Phil, give us a beat, something we can call it right or an erection song too. And they're off and running. It's the same chord structure, the same guitar solos. But if you loved Back in Black, this is a great companion piece to that seminal, amazing, I've used the word seminal too many times, that amazing rock record by AC/DC. I'm just a huge fan.
It's an interesting choice because, obviously it's 1981, so you can't choose Back in Black because that came out in 80, but it was their first number one record, right? This one went to number one because this thing was the group was massively popular after Back in Black. That was their big breakthrough from being a solid rock act, but from Australia and people looking at those interesting album covers with Angus Young to something that was just like, I just love AC/DC, man. So that was a big record for them. I have a brief AC/DC story for you, John.
I'm ready.
So back in 88, I went to, my parents immigrated from South America to eventually the United States from a small country called Guyana. And I went there with my mother for about almost a month. We were coming back to the United States and we had to catch our flight back to San Francisco and Miami. And I'm sitting there waiting for the plane and I'm just chit-chatting with my mom. And I look across at the gate and I see these two guys and I'm like, God, those guys look like guys from AC/DC. They really do. That looks like Brian Johnson and that looks like Malcolm Young. And then they said, well, first class passengers, aboard. And they got up and they went, I knew it. I knew it. So I get on the plane and there they were in first class. I said, you're the guys from AC/DC, right? Brian Johnson jumps up. He goes, yeah, yeah, yeah. How you doing, mate? And he gives me a big, rocking handshake. And then I said, what are you guys doing on the plane? Oh, we're going to Los Angeles to mix our next album. And I said, okay, well, great. I sat down in my seat. Every other guy, of course, it is primarily a guy's band, but every other guy that came on that flight, so like, oh my God, AC/DC's on this flight. It's like
I love
shaking their hands and everything.
Now,
And then they proceeded to get super drunk for the 5-hour flight back to Los Angeles. So that was.
Now I've got to ask, was Brian Johnson wearing that little like leather derby?
Yeah, he was wearing that cap.
He's never caught
cap
without the cap. Good for him. That's kind of like Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't see Brian Johnson. It's so out of context to see pictures of him without that cap on. That's just the look.
So now it's just a shorthand in our house. It's like, we're going to Los Angeles to mix our album.
Hey, Julie, where are you going? I'm going to Los Angeles to mix my album. Can I steal that from my own home?
You can. Absolutely. Okay. It's all yours. Beautiful. And anybody in this podcast, if you really wanted a little bit of a shorthand, where are you off to today? Going to Los Angeles to mix my album.
Well, speaking of albums, Ted, where's number one with you, my brother?
Number one, it's probably no surprise for people who know me, but it is Rush's Moving Pictures. Rush story, real quick. The comedian Chris Rock had a joke a while back. This is years ago. He would say, you always see that one black kid at the Van Halen concert. I was that black kid. I was the one brown kid at the Rush concert back in 1981 for the Moving Pictures tour. But I didn't really know their music when I went to see them. I knew The Spirit of Radio and maybe Free Will from the album prior to that, Permanent Waves. I got invited by some guys at my school and they had an extra ticket. So I went with them to the Oakland Coliseum, and this is either June 4th or June 5th, 1981. I can't remember which date I went to. And I sat through the whole concert, and they were all like, wow, well, that was amazing. They were going off because they were huge Rush fans, and I was sort of quiet. And they said, well, what did you think? I said, those guys were fantastic. I mean, it was amazing. And then I said, but it's really weird, guys, because it's like I'm in a dream right now, but I'm not in a dream, but it's like I'm in a dream. And they're like, you're high. I'm like, I didn't smoke anything. They're like, no. It's a contact high. We're sitting in the nosebleed. We're at the top section. Didn't you notice all those people blowing pot? And I was like, no, because, my stupid 16-year-old self, no, you can't get high from just breathing it in around you. They're like, I think you can. I'm like, but isn't it weird how we're in a dream? We're in a dream,
and why do I want to eat a bunch of Pringles right now?
Exactly.
What's going on?
So they said, let's just go outside and get some fresh air. You'll feel fine. I just absolutely love this record. I mean, it's just a classic record, really. I mean, you can go from start to finish and there's not a bad track. Even when you go to quote unquote side 2 and you flip it over and it's the non-hit side, if you will, there's still great songs. Everything from The Camera Eye to Witch Hunt to Vital Signs. Fantastic. That's my number one.
Witch Hunt is weirdly my favorite mood song from that album. And Rush could create so many great moods. They were such amazing, not only instrumentalists, but the way they put their albums together. As a drummer, Tom Sawyer, that drum break will, and probably I'm not the only one who feels this way, will reverberate in my DNA forever. I would just rewind the cassette because I had 2 cassettes in my car at all times in 1981 for those about to rock and Moving Pictures. And I would rewind that section so I could hear Neil Peart do that solo, that drum break in the middle of Tom Sawyer over and over again until whoever was riding in my car was like, can we hear the next freaking song, please? Stop it.
Let's
ba 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 ba.
Right.
Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Oh, come on.
I mean, that takes that song from its, sort of its beginnings, which is there's nothing flashy going on at the beginning, really. And then it just builds and builds and builds. And there's no real chorus in there, but still, it's a fantastic song and a fantastic record.
Oh, great choice, Ted Asregadoo. Great choice.
And this has been a fun little jog down 1981 memory lane, don't you think?
It has been more than fun. In fact, I hurt my fingers doing that last little drum solo across this old metal desk I'm using, and my dog got a little out of control, which is not surprising. But going down these memory lanes, if you will, with another person my age who was experiencing it a little bit differently in Northern California. I was down in SoCal, but it is so fun to find those intersections we find where, oh my gosh, I felt the same way. That album for you too? For you too?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mind blown. Very cool.
So before we go, do you have like an honorable mention that you just want to throw in there real quick?
God, that's so hard to do to me. I'm going to let you go first. You
I
do,
could
you
go
do your
first. I
honorable
could go
mention. There's
first.
so many going on in that year, it turns out, but you go ahead and hit me with your
I'll go
honorable
first, and
mention.
then I'll give you a chance to kind of just think about it.
Right.
My honorable mention is U2's October.
Ah, all right.
Yeah, it's got Gloria on there, which that was the first U2 song I ever saw because it was played on MTV as the video. But from that moment that I saw that song and heard it, I had to have this record, and it has just become one of those. I guess you want to call it a sleeper album for U2 because it's not one of their blockbuster records, but I just find that the Edge's guitar work, the lyrics, the way Bono sings, just the whole vibe of the album, I really got into it. So that's my honorable mention.
Okay, let me give honorable mention. We'll revisit Mr. Phil Collins again, but the album Abacab, we touched on it very briefly as we were talking about Genesis earlier in the podcast. Genesis was slowly becoming an afterthought as Phil Collins' solo career went berserk in the early 80s. And Abacab is a pretty solid rock record. Again, something that Genesis wasn't necessarily, not sure they were a progressive rock band, I get it. But if you were a guitar-focused nut job like I was and still am, Genesis didn't always do it for you from a guitar perspective. Abacab got a little bit nasty is a strong word to use when you're talking about Genesis.
Yeah,
But
they're not the nastiest band, are
yeah,
they?
we're not nasty, man. We're precision, right? Right. I would give Abacab credit for breaking free a little bit of the stodginess that was pre-1981 Genesis, and that's why they would make my honorable mention.
That's a good place to end. John, thank you so much for being on this segment of the Rooks and Becords podcast. It's always fun getting together with you, my friend.
Appreciate it. Love you, Ted. Take care, brother.
That's a snippet from New Jersey-based recording artist D.W. Dunphy. That's a track called Ocean Floor. It's off his new album, Charm Offensive. D.W. has been producing music since 2002. A look at his discography shows that he's recorded 12 albums by my count, as well as EPs and singles. His entire catalog, including Charm Offensive, his newest album, is available at the online record store Bandcamp. Now, I've known DW since 2008 when we both started writing for the music and pop cultural site Popdose, where for a time he was the editor-in-chief, but currently he writes for Ultimate Classic Rock, MusicTap, and Looper. But in this episode, DW doesn't have to do a lick of writing at all because he's my guest on the Rooks and Becords podcast. Hello, DW, and welcome.
Hello, and boy, are my fingers tired.
Did I get that right? 12 albums since 2002?
Kind of. I actually started back in 95, but those were only like cassette-only things, and it's kind of hilarious when you think about how technology has come to the point where it is now, where major label artists are recording on laptops.
Now, you are absolutely prolific. That's the one thing I looked at. I was looking at your catalog. I was like, do you sleep? No, you do not. Okay.
No, I do not.
Before we get to your music, I want to talk a bit about an article you wrote for MusicTap, which is called There Are No Bands Anymore? There's a question mark in parentheses, in which you took aim at some comments Maroon 5 band leader Adam Levine made with New Zealand DJ and TV host Zane Lowe. You do somewhat agree with Levine, right?
Unfortunately, yeah, I do. It's funny because when that went up, I think that I had the most feedback for an article for years now.
I know the feeling. You write something and you put your heart and soul into it, and then you get like very little, if any, feedback. And it's like, wow, is anyone in here?
This is sort of a side comment, and we'll get back to, the main topic. The side comment is that I wrote for many years on Popdose, just working out big articles, little articles, very in-depth articles. And the article that got me the most attention was 5 Reasons Why Caillou is Bald. It's like, Did you see my heart-wrenching article about, Roy Orbison? No, Caillou was bald. So, thanks.
So continue
But,
with what we were talking about earlier, with which is Adam Levine. Do you agree with
right.
him?
I got all this feedback from people who were dumbfounded with my being dumbfounded. They were like, what do you mean that there are no bands anymore? How can you possibly agree with him? And I don't agree with him necessarily that there are no bands anymore, because there are. What I agree with is that the gatekeepers of the world of music don't really support bands. They support solo acts. They support
Hmm.
acts that you group up a mega producer who can make a beat and a singer who can sing over the beat. You've got a track. It could be a huge track. If you get it on the right Spotify influencers channel, it could shoot up, overnight. This is kind of what happened with Lil Nas X with Old Town Road. There is asset management in solo acts, especially now. You don't have to spend as much to support them. Return on investment is great. And, if you're thinking about a band as a little company that is tied to a larger corporation, you've got these 5 employees or 4 employees in this company, and they kind of hold each other back when 2 are fighting. So when I said that I kind of agreed with Levine, just look at the top 100. Find me actual, like, we play guitars, we play drums, we're a band, and you will find very few. Where I took issue with him is that if anybody should be not just wondering where the bands are, but championing and making bands big, it should be him. He's one of the biggest people who has a quasi band right now. Although, again, that's speculative, because most people don't know the names of anyone other than Adam Levine in Maroon 5.
One of the things that you were talking about in your article was the fact that oftentimes, especially with current bands that are technically bands, but we tend to spotlight the front person, right? You look at Coldplay. Can you name every member of Coldplay? No, but you probably know who Chris Martin is, right? That's been going on for a while. I mean, since I've been a young lad buying music back in the late 70s and into the 80s when I was older. Think about this. You have Blondie, The Pretenders, Destiny's Child, U2, Genesis. But you peel away the front person, you've got Deborah Harry, Chrissy Hynde, Beyonce, Bono, and Phil Collins, all of whom have done solo work, whether it's as a solo artist or as a solo project. But we tend to remember the front person more. And that's not something that is new, but it's something that is more accentuated now, I would say, than it has in the past. Whereas when Chrissy Hynde was a member of the Pretenders, she never said, I'm going to be a solo artist and just do Chrissy Hynde with some side players, which is kind of what it's become now. But anyway, the point is that she felt like she was in a band. Bono says U2 is the band. We are a band. When Phil Collins recorded with Genesis, at least vocally, he says, I'm part of a band. This is Genesis. It's not Phil Collins and Genesis, that sort of thing. But this sort of peeling off the front person and saying, they're the star. They're the Johnny Bravo. The suit fits them. We should make them the star. That's been a thing that labels have been trying to do for a very long time and continue to do.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. At the same time, I have to feel like the labels of the past had A&R departments that were more committed to fostering the talent. Therefore, I don't think that the people at Charisma Virgin in the UK, and Atlantic in the United States necessarily wanted that either or, the band or Phil Collins. They were kind of glad to have the band and Phil Collins, because they were two
separate revenue streams, right? Yeah.
And then Tony Banks was recording his own stuff, and then Mike Rutherford was with Mike and the Mechanics. So there was kind of that sense that we could have multiple contracts with the members. And I don't think that a band would stand for that anymore. I would like to see how things shake up with Hayley Williams of Paramore, whether after 2 solo albums she is still the front woman for Paramore or whether that's done. I think that's going to be a bellwether for whether all this is actually true or not.
Now, you have recorded non-vocal albums, also known as instrumental albums. You have one that I really liked called People Wearing Masks. And a few podcasts ago, I spotlighted the latest album by Mogwai, the one that went to #1 in February of 2021 when it was released in the UK. And that's mostly instrumentals. I want to play a little bit from your 2018 album that I just referenced, People Wearing Masks. This is called Bargaining Chips and Broken Glass. It's very cinematic. Mogwai, they caught a break by getting a song featured in a French TV series that got some traction outside of France when I think it was Netflix or Amazon. One of the two started streaming it. What about you? TVs and movies. Well, there's really not a lot of independent television, but certainly independent films. Is that an avenue either for you or for other artists to pursue to get your music out there?
I know there are a lot of people who market themselves as people who score music. They work through Fiverr. For example, that's one of the places where you can find people who will make instrumental music for your project. Or you could offer your services as an instrumental music provider for someone's project on Fiverr.
Those are some of the ways that musicians get their music out there. They go through this online service essentially.
And there are some people who are veterans like Liz Phair. Prior to the Fun Style album, which depending on how you feel is either okay or kind of a low turn for her career. But prior to that, she was doing a lot of television scoring for, I believe it's a show on the CW. I feel that for musicians, sometimes it's freeing just to be on the instrument and kind of let the instrument do the talking. And then you don't have to worry about, am I beating up a cliche? Am I beating up the girl world heart torn apart travails that we've heard all throughout the history of music? Are we doing something new? You just sit there and you record and you kind of let the instrument take over.
But after that, you have to almost put on, because you're an indie, you're an independent artist, you got to put on your other hats, which are, how do I get this music out there? So how do you promote your music? I mean, I know you're on Bandcamp, but how does an independent, or how do independent artists, because you probably worked with others, what are their avenues? What sort of ways do they get out their music out there so people are more aware of it?
There's a lot of networking. There's a lot of getting on social media, letting people know, making sure that you're in groups within the social media sphere where you can tell people that it's out there. You do a lot of interviews where you can. There is a way that you can send messages to different webzines and websites. There are services where you essentially buy credits, and with the credits, you can get the sites to at least listen to them, and maybe they'll do a review, maybe they won't. I think YouTube is actually a very good place for promotion. A lot of people are down on YouTube, and in some cases, they have every right to be. But with YouTube and somebody who is committed and has at least enough of the basic equipment to put together a lyric video or an image video, if it's instrumental or whatever, you don't need to be a Scorsese to come up with a video to promote yourself on YouTube. And I think that's probably one of the number one ways. One of the other ways is like with TuneCore. Again, you have to pay to make sure your songs are on Spotify and Apple Music and Amazon Music. But it's, I don't want to say necessary evil, because I don't think it's evil, but it is the necessary that if you want to record music and you don't want it to be just this weird hobby you do while you're an insomniac, you're going to need to get on streaming services. You will not make money off of streaming services. You just won't. But if you believe in what you did, you've got to take it all the way to the finish line. And part of that is getting it out to the public and allowing the court of public opinion, big or small, to pass judgment on you. That's why people make things, so other people will hear them. If they like it, then great, maybe you can have a fan. If they don't like it, they'll probably never listen to it again. You're not going to make money off of streaming. The odds are stacked against you.
Right. And do you make money off of the physical copy of your product? Because there's some sunk cost into that, because you have to front the cost of, pressing the vinyl and I guess putting together the CD as well.
There are costs involved, but again, it's one of those things that it's almost weird if you don't have it, but there's a good chance that you're not going to get a huge call for it. It sounds counterintuitive, especially for somebody, an artist who's on a fixed budget and can't afford to go spending a lot of money to do physical product, but you have to prove that you are in all the spots, because the spot you're not in becomes a glaring void. So what I mean by that is that I get most of my traffic, most of my response from Bandcamp. Bandcamp is probably the best, most artist-friendly thing out there. But Spotify is the most used because it's the most convenient. And you're going to get fractions of pennies for your streams if people are actually streaming you. I don't believe that it is necessarily the boon to independent artists that some would have you believe. From my perspective, Daniel Ek, who is the CEO of Spotify, said in an interview recently, or whether it was a rollout of product or something, they want to start making like A-level tier groupings where you will pay to be in this grouping and you will get more visibility.
The old pay to play, huh? Okay.
It is. Right. Now, if you are an independent artist, you're not going to do that. If you are a major label, of course you're going to do that.
Absolutely, you're going to do it, because you're going to want to carve out as much of that real estate as you can. DW, unfortunately, we're hitting our time wall. But I wanted to thank you for being on the Rooks and Becords podcast, and congratulations on the new album called Charm Offensive. It's available on the online record store that DW just referenced, which is Bandcamp. And if you want the actual full-on URL, it's DW Dunphy. That's DUNPHY.bandcamp.com. Thanks, DW.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
As episode 11 of the Rooks and Becords podcast comes to a close, I just want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast. And if you can, leave a comment on Apple Podcasts about how much you like our little show here. There are other platforms that carry the Rooks and Becords podcast, like iHeartRadio, Amazon/Audible, Spotify, Google, and Stitcher. So wherever you get your podcasts, Rooks and Becords is probably there. Until next time, I'm Ted, and I'll be back soon to talk more about books and records.